Oh, well, welcome to the final week of class. Uh, didn't really end the way I was hoping, but that's okay. We dealt with it. So, one of the last things I wanted to talk about is Egyptomania. Um, Egypt has such an appeal for so many people. There's tons of documentaries about Egypt, all over, Amazon Prime and cable and everything. And we're going to look a little bit at the appeal of Egypt, why people are so fascinated with Egypt. We're going to look a little bit at the curse of the pharaohs and mummies, and we're also going to look at why Egypt is such a special fascination for people engaged in the pseudo-archaeology, and what kind of pseudo-archaeology applies to ancient Egypt. So obviously, a big part of this has to do with mummies. Not all these ancient civilizations have mummies. South America has some mummies. There are other cultures as well. Like in the western deserts of China. But there are numerous mummies in Egypt. And because Egypt was close to Europe, it was accessible to Europeans in the late 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, up until today. So mummies, Egyptian mummies, have long been a theme of fiction, since really the early 1800s. And mummies kind of reflect different aspects of Western ideas. So sometimes mummies reflect sort of the ambiguous relationship with Europe and Egypt in terms of colonialism, sometimes sort of sexual fantasies and romantic fantasies. And we're going to look at a couple of these, over time. So why Egypt? Why is Egypt such a fascination? And some people believe that part of the reason is that Egypt is exotic and familiar at the same time. It's, again, close to Europe, but it's the Middle East. It's a mixture of different cultures. They had interesting, strange gods, beautiful artwork. There's stuff that you can obviously see is similar in Egyptian culture to Western culture, but then obviously important differences. So it has that exotic, but it's not so strange to Westerners that it's unrelatable, I guess, is what some people like to say. And also some of the important historical figures. So even before mummy fiction, people like Shakespeare were writing, plays about Antony and Cleopatra. So figures like Cleopatra, Akhenaten, they've had a long importance in the West. Of course, biblical connections, right? And so a lot of films that deal with Egypt. Here you can see, this is the Ten Commandments. A lot of films that deal with Egypt either look at ancient Egypt, mummy movies, biblical movies. Those are usually the films that are set in Egypt. The artwork is beautiful. And this is just one picture inside the tomb, but you have perfectly preserved or nearly preserved stone buildings, temples and tombs, the pyramids, of course, and we're going to talk about the pyramids. You have, their obsession with death and the afterlife, incredible preservation of artifacts that you really don't get in many places in the world. Mummies. This is the mummy of Seti I, who many people believe is sort of the inspiration for the appearance of the early mummies in the movies. You can see how well preserved he is. Seti I was the father of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great. Of course, the pyramids, which were tourist attractions in classical Greece. So the Greeks kind of had already in the 6th century BC, 5th century BC, already had this kind of mystical view of Egypt as an ancient land with interesting customs and secret knowledge, right? So that started very, very early. And of course, there's sort of like the pure escapism of Egypt. So This is the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas, obviously. You can see with the pyramid-shaped hotel and the Sphinx in front of it. And so Egyptomania has been around for a while. You could start with the ancient Greeks. They were fascinated with Egypt. They recognized it as a very ancient civilization that had predated theirs. You had early Greek period Egyptian historians like Manetho, who were beginning to write about Egyptian history at this point. Right. So there's sort of a respect that the Greeks had for ancient Egypt, and that they had this kind of access to secret occult knowledge. That becomes another sort of appeal of Egypt. Herodotus, said there's so many marvels in the world. They have existed ever since men existed upon the earth. And of course, it opens up to the west. Egypt opens up to the west with Napoleon and his conquest of Egypt, where he brought scholars with him. This is when the Rosetta Stone was discovered. The French made a copy of it. The British defeated Napoleon and took possession of the Rosetta Stone. There was basically a race to decipher it. Champollion really was the first one to decipher it. Once the hieroglyphs were deciphered, then the whole new world had opened up to scholars, because they could now read the inscriptions and read about magic and superstition, religion, history, all sorts of things. Then the 1800s, you had more and more tourism and organized tourism. So you had tour groups like Thomas Cook's and Son, which was a famous tour company run out of England that did Nile River cruises. If you've ever read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, right? Mark Twain actually in the 1800s went on an organized tour of the Mediterranean and also Egypt and the Holy Land and writes about it. So you had more and more tourists. This, obviously continues today. One of the main industries in Egypt, obviously, is suffering now. But, one of the main industries historically is tourism. So you could see some tourists on the top of one of the pyramids having some tea. Then they were bringing back the artifacts for museums and also mummies. So people buying mummies. We have a couple of mummies in the Grand Rapids Public Museum. One poorly preserved mummy, you can see on display if you ever go back to the public museum, was bought by a Grand Rapids tourist while in Egypt. Someone approached him offering to sell him a mummy. He bought it. He brought it home to Grand Rapids. They also had these mummy unwrappings, as you can see here. We're going to hear more about this from our presentation. Aaron is going to present on the Curse of the Pharaohs. Talk a little bit about these mummy unwrappings. But you can see some of the invitations and the billboards that kind of presented this. This was sort of entertainment for a while in Europe. Then you have the influence of Egyptomanian literature, art, occult beliefs. This was compounded or increased with the discovery of Tut's tomb in 1922. We're approaching the 100th anniversary of the discovery. Egypt is planning that they are completely redoing the exhibit at the Cairo Museum. They've built a whole new wing just for, I think, the treasures of King Tut, and they're going to have a grand opening, I think, to mark the 100th anniversary, and it will be pretty impressive. They've done a lot of conservation work on these artifacts. Of course, the treasures of King Tut are some of the most famous in the world. So we've got an ebb and flow in interest in Egypt, but it really has never disappeared. With early occultists, these you find this with the Rosicrucians. They're sort of a mystic group that combines all sorts of elements of ancient Eastern philosophy. Right, this is you can see San Jose, California. One of their museums looks like an Egyptian-style temple. The Freemasons adopted a lot of Egyptian motifs, but you can see here in this Masonic temple, they also have Assyrian, right, ancient Greek. So they took a lot of different cultures and combined them together. But, of course, the pyramid is such a potent symbol for many, many people. It was used by many different groups, including the Golden Dawn. And here you can see Aleister Crowley, who's kind of this occultist, famous occultist in England. You even have an influence on architecture. So you have a whole school of what's called Egyptian Revival architecture. This is the tomb of A.B. Watson. He's buried here in Grand Rapids. He was a Grand Rapidian who was a famous officer in the Civil War and also became a very prominent businessman.